Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Human healer refused to touch the dying alien leopard, until it whispered his name. By the time Mira returned to the capital city of Serenus, the summit had fractured. Some species delegates had left the planet entirely, vanishing into private warp channels with coded silence. Others had remained, drawn not by loyalty to the Empire's rhythms but by curiosity, by the scent of a change they couldn't name. Protesters gathered outside the Unity chambers, holding loft banners in languages both living and long forgotten, calling for reform, for recognition, for truth. Most of them didn't mention Mira by name, yet her story was in every breath they took. Within the towers of the council hall, polished stone now cracked beneath 1,000 feet that marched with silent unrest, and not all were in opposition. Some were merely watching the way animals watch the horizon before a storm breaks, waiting to see if the lightning would strike. In the center of it all, Mira moved as if in a dream, not because she doubted herself, no, that part had solidified, but because she understood now how quickly one heartbeat could become an avalanche. She had not sought rebellion, she had not lifted banners or speeches, she had only laid her hands on a dying creature and refused to let him die. And sometimes that was enough, sometimes that was everything. Silrax had returned to the Spire of Flames, the ancestral seat of the Nether, where the fires were lit only for death, for rights, and for war. He had opened the gates not only to fellow elders but to everyone present. Before fires that had once judged criminals and kings, he had invited others to speak, survivors, medics, peacekeepers, those whose hands bore calluses from work rather than war. Mira watched them gather. Species who had never before stood beneath the same roof now broke bread by firelight, murmuring stories in their own tongues yet sharing one language of common pain. It was during one of these gatherings that the attack came. It wasn't loud, no shockwave, no invasion, just a flicker of movement across the outer balconies of the spire, a cloaked figure moving like a shadow as it pressed something metallic into the pillar that held the flame of judgment, a bomb not designed to kill, but to desecrate, to destroy the space that had become a symbol of unity. Before the device could fully bloom its threat, Mira noticed the reflection, a mere shimmer on the flame-polished walls, as she returned from the inner archive with a stack of old medical texts tucked beneath her arm. The books dropped from her grasp. She didn't have time to think as the figure activated the timer. Colliding with the saboteur full force, she sent the device skidding across the stone. The man hissed something in a dialect she did not recognize and struck out with a blade, thin, gleaming, and poisoned, but Mira twisted beneath his attack, grappling him by the arm. He was fast, yet she had lived through worse. With determination, she slammed his head into the stone. Once, twice, he went limp. The bomb blinked, 3 seconds. Without a moment's hesitation, she dove for it. The pain was brief and blinding, the explosion was muted, its force redirected by her body shielding the core, brutal, yet not lethal. She awoke to firelight and the sound of familiar breath beside her. Silrax lay beside her like a mountain that had learned to kneel. "You saw it," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I saw enough," she murmured, her ribs fractured and her hands burnt, but she was alive. He looked at her for a long time. "I would have died again if not for you. Not on my watch." And then, before anyone else could arrive, he spoke words she had never heard from him before, not just gratitude, not honor, "I am proud of you." His words fell like embers into the night, and Mira, broken but breathing, managed a smile, because sometimes survival, in itself, was a revolution. The next morning, Mira awoke to silence, not the calm silence of peace, but the weighty silence of decision. The courtyard below the spire was filled with beings of every shape and kind, gathered not by command but by instinct. They came not with demands but with oaths, oaths of healing, of unity, of choosing life even when death seemed easier. Silrax emerged from the highest ledge, his fur matted with smoke and his golden eyes unreadable. He carried no weapon and wore no armor, yet when he spoke, the galaxy listened. "I once believed strength was found in who could stand tallest, roar loudest, tear deepest." He paused thoughtfully, but strength is in the woman who covered a bomb with her body to protect a fire meant to warm strangers. All eyes turned to Mira as she stood slowly, wrapped in healing gauze and stubbornness, one hand clutching her side while the other gripped a carved staff from the nether. "I did not come for ceremony, yet ceremony has come for me," she acknowledged softly. Silrax looked down at her. "Dr. Mira Kalin of Earth, of no throne and no crest, do you accept the oath of flame?" She frowned. "I don't know what it is." He grinned in response. "That is what makes you worthy." Descending from the dais, he walked toward her and laid a massive paw upon her chest. "With this oath, you are bound not to species, not to laws, but to breath, to the living heartbeat of every being who dares believe in peace, to walk in fire and not burn, to reach through death and pull life back." Mira's knees buckled, not from weakness, but from the weight of meaning, and the gathered crowd bent one knee as well, not in submission but in solidarity. For the first time since the Empire's birth, the galaxy witnessed something built not on fear or conquest, but on hope. The Oath of Flame would spread, not as law but as legacy, and Mirielin, a human medic from a blue world on the edge of relevance, became its first bearer, not by title but by choice. Far from Serenus, where twin suns warmed the fires of revolution and where Silrax's paw print had transformed centuries of silence into dialogue, there lay the spine of stars, a belt of dying systems once colonized for mineral wealth, now hollowed into blackened voids and unspoken suffering. The Empire's reach was weakest there, which made that region perfect for what came next. The Council of Rights, the quiet hand behind the oldest laws of separation, did not sit in courts, hold summits, or make speeches. They were robed in myth and hidden in shadow, caring not for popularity but solely for order. And Mira Kalin, disorder made flesh, struck at the very heart of that order. One of their own had witnessed Silrax speak the old phrases, not to another nether, but to a human, and had felt the silent solidarity of the crowd spark into movement. In response, the council decreed not execution but dismantling. They knew that killing Mira now would have rendered her immortal. Instead, they would erase her legacy, undermine the very notion of her being. They would smear, twist, and fracture her into myth, then drown that myth in bureaucracy and slow decay. They termed it administrative amputation, first isolate, then divide, then disbelieve. The first strike was not aimed directly at Mira but at those inspired by her. Within a week, 3 allied healers who had trained under her were publicly discredited. Their medical licenses were revoked for fabricated errors. One was accused of performing soul rites without cultural permission, another's off-world clinic was burned, a third simply vanished on a resupply route, never to be found again. Word of these calamities filtered back to Serenus, and Mira felt every gaze like a needle beneath her ribs. Yet it was the message attached to the third healer's wrecked beacon that finally stirred her resolve. It bore no words, only a symbol, an ancient mark of the Rights Council, a closed eye crossed by 3 lines, a warning, a signature, a declaration that the old guard had emerged from the shadows to strike. Standing on the balcony of the Spire of Flames, Mira gripped the railing with hands trembling with fury that was not born of vengeance but of grief. Below, the city's pulse continued, a harmony of lives that still believed in what she and Silrax had begun, but above them loomed the shadow of something vast and cold. Silrax approached quietly, his paws near silent on the marble. His mane had grown grayer in recent weeks, age was catching him at last. "They're trying to erase what you gave us," she said in a low tone. "They cannot," he replied, as calm as ever. "They already have, and they'll keep going until no one is left to carry it." He regarded her carefully, as though watching a flame decide whether to burn or to warm. "Then it is time," he declared at last, "to bring them into the light." He turned to leave, and she followed. That night, the sky over Serenus transformed. It was not a weapon, not quite, but a transmission, shaped into constellations, a burst of light, a chorus of beacons. Every satellite in the quadrant broadcast a single phrase in every known language, "Let the Hidden One speak." It was neither Mira's voice nor Silrax's alone, it was the unison of medics, wanderers, healers without crests, and every forgotten being who had dwelt in the shadows of tradition, now burned into the night. Across the empire, the watchers stirred because the flame had refused to go out and had begun to roar. The Council of Rights had always relied on inertia as their weapon, time, the slow turning of the stars, the fading of memory, the inevitability of forgetting. But this time it did not work, because Mira did not forget and Silrax did not forgive. What began as mere whispers turned into unstoppable movement, peace caravans, healing festivals, cross-species aid routes where once only merchants or soldiers dared to travel. Entire sectors reopened to collaboration, guided not by the dictates of empires but by the generosity of volunteers. Mira led them all, not as a general, but as a medic. She journeyed throughout the Rim territories aboard the Second Breath, a once-war frigate now repurposed as a mobile hospital and refugee sanctuary, and at her side came emissaries from 10 different species, including the Cubs of the Night, the Children of the Tamari, and even former Empire fleet medics who had resigned to embrace the Oath of Flame on Narsil. She halted a plague by sharing blood on Vestra's halo, she delivered twins in a storm, one of them heralded as the firstborn of a mixed planetary union, and everywhere she ventured, small fires were lit. These flame altars were symbolic, not objects of worship, serving instead as memorials to the moment when breath was returned to one who was never meant to need saving. But the pressure grew. The Empire began declaring these sanctuary zones unauthorized, with aid stations designated as destabilizing. Border patrols grew increasingly hostile, vessels were stopped, their supplies confiscated, and then came a letter, sealed in obsidian wax and delivered by drone from the Empire's High Tribunal. Mira was summoned to Velator, the core world capital, to answer charges of galactic destabilization. It was a trap, a fact known to all, but Mira accepted it. She arrived not with a fleet, but accompanied by Silrax. The old Leopard, slower now with aching joints and a deeper, labored breath, came not to fight but to bear witness. The tribunal chamber was vast, built into a canyon that pulsed with ancient shields. Mira stood at its center, her boots echoing through the space. The judges looked down from silver towers, unreadable and cold. "You are Mira Kalin," declared the High Arbitrator, accused of insurrection by action. "I'm a medic," she replied. "I save lives. You have dismantled cultural pillars, I have challenged those who left people to die, you risk civil collapse." As she raised her chin, the chamber seemed to shift, murmurs passed among the judges. Then a voice arose from the shadows, not Silrax, not another Nether, but from a lone observer seated behind. "I'm alive because of her," said a small child from Varilon, whose lungs had failed before her arrival. Another voice followed, "She taught me to mend broken wings." Yet another stated, "She helped us when the fleets would not." One by one, voices, pilots, farmers, old warriors, scholars, emerged, bearing witness rather than rebellion. Finally, Silrax rose slowly, with deliberate effort. "I once stood above all of you," he said, "but now I kneel beside her." The judges offered no reply, the verdict was already clear. Mira did not need permission, the fire had walked its own path, and the galaxy had chosen to follow. The council did not collapse that day. The High Tribunal recessed into silence, issuing neither edict nor punishment, nor absolution. But as Mira left the grand chamber beneath the shadowed towers of Velator, she knew a foundation had cracked, not with thunder or fire, but with the steady cadence of footsteps and one voice after another proclaiming, "I am still here because of her." The silence from the tribunal chambers did not stifle the movement, it widened it. On worlds far from the core, entire cities began declaring their allegiance not to ancient hierarchies but to the Oath of Flame. The symbol, once known only to those initiated in etheric rites, now appeared on clinic doors, transport hubs, and medical frigates. It was etched into armor, woven into ribbons, and painted on the shells of refugee vessels. Wherever the sigil shone, it signified safety, proof that someone, somewhere, knew how to bring back a breath without asking the favor of one species. Yet the Empire was not finished. The Council of Rights, now driven by desperation rather than patience, made one final play. They sent an edict to the entire quadrant, a decree not seen since the days of the Extinction Wars, that declared the Oath of Flame an illegal ideology, reclassifying soul binding between species as biological heresy, and naming Mirielin not only as a dissenter but as an anomaly, a phenomenon to be isolated rather than a mere criminal. Silrax received the decree in the Hall of Ashes, where the names of his ancestors were carved into obsidian walls. Standing before their silent echoes, he clutched the scroll in one paw. When Mira entered, she found him quiet. "They don't understand," she said softly. "They do," he replied, his tone as calm as ever, "which is why they're afraid." His voice now carried a rasp, and he walked slower. Time was catching up with him even as his defiance endured. "They will try to take this from you, they already have, but not everything," she murmured. "No," he agreed, "not everything." That night, Mira stood before a transmission altar, its crystals flickering with the breath of stars, and sent one final message, unencrypted, unsheltered, so that it could be seen by every world, every border, every being. She spoke simply, "You cannot unmake what has been given. You cannot erase gratitude. I reached for a dying life, he gave me a flame, and that fire is no longer his or mine, it belongs to everyone who chooses to carry it." Then she cut the feed. The reaction was swift. Two of the inner core worlds formally defected from Imperial doctrine the next morning, and the Council responded by issuing a warrant to seize the second breath. Mira and Silrax knew what would come next. They prepared, not for battle, but for an arrival. They returned to Serenus, to the summit site where it had all begun, and there they waited. Ships arrived within a day, Empire destroyers, dark and silent, their massive engines rumbling through the atmosphere like distant growls beneath the earth. Then came the others, the flamebearers, not warships but relief vessels, medical carriers, merchant convoys, hundreds in all, arriving not to fight but to stand. A ring of light formed around Serenus as ships aligned in an orbital vigil, each carrying survivors, witnesses, healers. The Empire hesitated, not because it could not win, but because it no longer knew what winning would look like. Would it bomb a hospital convoy? Would it silence an old leopard who had once ended a galaxy-wide war? Would it gun down a medic who had never fired a weapon? Standing beside Mira on the ridge of flame and overlooking a wide valley teeming with thousands gathered to watch the sky, Silrax said, "If this is the end, I regret nothing." "It's not the end," Mira replied. "How can you be sure?" "Because you're still here, and I'm still breathing." At that moment the lead Empire ship's signal changed, a single transmission, 2 words, "We hear." The destroyer's power down, and not a shot was fired. For the first time in recorded galactic history compassion had drawn a line the Empire could not cross. The sun rose over Serenus the next morning as if the world had never trembled. Birds sang and wind moved through stone, yet something had shifted irrevocably. The Council of Rights fell silent, not officially, but no new edicts or decrees followed in the ensuing months. Peace spread not from the heart of empires but from outposts, from the flame clinics where species once separated by terror now worked side by side, from ships painted with healing glyphs that crossed borders unchecked by fear, especially for Mira's students, who no longer questioned one's kind before offering aid. Silrax did not live to see the decade turn. One morning, beneath a blood-orange sky in the garden where Mira first taught cross-species triage to wandering orphans, he lay quietly. He neither spoke nor roared. He simply exhaled one last time and was gone. Mira sat with him for hours, and when at last she rose, she left behind no statue, only a flame tree. Its leaves, silver and gold, grew swiftly, and by the time the anniversary came, it had become the centerpiece of the new summit, where no robes were required and all languages were spoken. Above the entrance to the central hall, etched into the stone by claws and firelight, was the phrase Silrax had once spoken when the entire galaxy had listened, "He reached into the dark." Beneath it, Mira had added her own words, "And I will never stop reaching." So the fire stayed lit, not merely as myth, but in practice, in every life saved, every barrier crossed, every single breath returned.